start looking at John chapter 1. Words have meaning, but they don't really have the full meaning outside of the context that you are reading them in. Unfortunately, sometimes we as teachers forget that, and we tend to pull words out of context and then make them mean the same thing kind of no matter where you find them. This unfortunately happens a lot with the Greek words for love. I don't know if you've ever heard lessons on the words for love. Brotherly love and selfless love and friendship love. The problem that happens whenever you do that is you work yourself in some pretty awkward situations whenever you run into a context where that particular word is used in a different fashion, and then you try to fit that in. When you look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, there's a couple passages that use that agape love, that selfless love, as we often talk about, in some very selfish circumstances. It doesn't always work. And whenever you assign meaning to a word, regardless of the context, you kind of work yourself into a lot of problems. That comes up again when you look at words like ecclesia, which I know I'm not a Greek scholar. I don't think that you guys are Greek scholars either, and that's fine. Ecclesia is the Greek word for assembly. And if you were to break that word apart, it is a combination of two other words, called and out. And sometimes we use that as a great analogy of, well, we as a church are called out of sin and called out of the world. And so whenever it talks about the assembly of the saints, well, it is the called out. The problem is that that doesn't always work. It would be very analogous to us saying that the word butterfly is butter that flies, because if you break that apart, it's two English words that if you put them together, it actually means something completely different. Whenever you have the riots in Acts, the people who are rioting are called an ecclesia. They're called a congregation, and it's not that they were individuals who were called out by God. It just happens that is an assembly. And so sometimes we assign meanings to words with a really poor exegesis. But that is kind of the things we have to wrestle with whenever we start studying the Bible. In John chapter 1, we're going to be looking at this here in a moment. There's also kind of two other things to consider whenever you do look at words. One is the direct context. And we're going to be looking here at the very first verses of John and talking about the context. The other thing to consider also is the historical, cultural background. Jonah is a great example. We are not really familiar with the city that Jonah was sent to go and prophesy to. I mean, Nineveh doesn't really mean anything to us personally because I've never been to Nineveh. You are probably the one who's most likely have gone to Nineveh, but I don't think you guys got to go to Nineveh. And Nineveh, they're not anything in particular. So it's just Jonah who's sent to go talk to a city. And if you don't know where Nineveh is, then you wouldn't maybe realize that it's not in Israel. And if you didn't know the historical, cultural context, you wouldn't realize just what kind of terrible things Nineveh has done to Israel itself. And so when Jonah is told to go and preach to a foreign people, and he knows that they are the enemies who have done just horrible, nasty things to Israel, killed people, and the list kind of goes on and on about all the nasty things. And you know that God is a gracious God and a forgiving God, and it begins to make sense kind of historically and culturally why Nineveh would flee the way that he did. And so you have the direct context that you read things in, and you also have the historical, cultural context in which you read things in. And you kind of try to combine both of those things to get an accurate understanding of the things that you're reading. And the same thing happens, that is what we kind of call an exegesis of a passage. And a hermeneutics is a kind of a methodology of reading through not just scripture, but kind of any text. And And I know that all those are really fun, big words of hermeneutics and exegesis. But all that is to say is that there's a method to it. But the same method you would use to understanding any book is really the same method that you would use to understand the Bible as well. So if we were to pick up a book that was written to a people who were maybe not English speakers, or written about a people who were not Americans, you would have to put yourself in that mindset in order to properly understand it. So when John, or pretty much any of the New Testament writers write, they write to a people who are not English-speaking Americans. And for that, we have to kind of put ourselves in that mindset a little bit to do so. So let's begin here in John chapter 1. Let's start reading there in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And there was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to bear witness about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness about the light. The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor the will of men, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, "This is he, of whom I said, he is coming after me, and he ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, now grace and truth comes through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." Now, these are probably verses that you've read through a number of times. These, I think, the first 10 verses or so were some of the first memory work that I remember. I have an older cousin who was my Bible class teacher for a few years, and she really liked to do memory verse, and so the first section of John was the first section we went through. In Greek class, John writes simplistically. His use of analogy and language and biblical references is profound, but he writes at a very simplistic level. And so John chapter 1 is actually some of the very first things you learn to translate. All that's to say is that we're probably really familiar with these verses. John 1 through 4 we talk about a lot. 14 we talk about a lot. And probably verses 16 through 18 as well are all verses that we talk about quite a bit. But why does he use the word word? In the beginning was the Word. He makes it very clear in verse 17 that the law was given through Moses, grace and truth come by Jesus Christ. We know who he's talking about in verse 1, but the question is, why does he use that terminology in verse 1? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He continues on in verse 14, and the Word became flesh. So the question is, well, why would he use that? The Greek word is logos, which is just the word for word. I mean, it is the word that we would use for word in the same way that they used it for word. But there's some really neat historical context. Now, John is writing to Jews, and they're going to have a historical context for the way that they use the word. John's also writing to Greeks. So if you look at the Gospels, Matthew is primarily, not entirely, but primarily written to a Jewish audience. He uses more Old Testament quotations and more fulfillment of prophecy in Matthew than the other Gospels do, because that's their historical background. That's what they need to come to the knowledge of truth. Mark is written to a Greek audience or a Gentile audience, and so he's a bit more fast-paced in the way that he tells the story. And so Matthew takes 28 chapters, Mark does in 16 chapters. In the same way that Luke writes down a very orderly account. So he says, I sat down to place in order the events that happened. And so for people who like things that are a bit more structured, Luke writes that to Theophilus. John, however, has a whole different theme that he writes his book to. And his audience isn't delegated to those who are either Jewish or Gentile. And so his book, while having a lot of Old Testament references, also he'll name something, and then he'll also give the Greek name for it. So he'll give the Hebrew name for the Hebrew audience, and then he'll explain that for the Gentile audience as well. So he does it really neat through the Gospel of John, where he is very specific on writing to both audiences. So there is some things I would like you to consider as we go through these verses. So he mentions here, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Now there's two different Greek words for God. There is Dios, which is just a generic, what we would probably see in our Bibles as a little case God. And then there is Theos, which is the capital God. And the reason there's two different words is because the Greeks had many gods, many dioses. When Paul goes into the Areopagus and he sees on Mars Hill all those 3,000 sculptures to their various gods, all of them are just dioses. They're just some gods that could have some power, some ability over creation as they saw it. But they also captured other people, including the Jews. And so they captured the Jews, and the Jews then need to have a term for their God, because their God had a very specific name. And so the name that they used is Theos. And so here in verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Theos, and the Word was Theos. So he's using the specific terminology for the Jews, for their one true God. But if you look at some of the writings of the Greeks, they had questions about the universe around them, and they kind of broke apart into some schools of thought. You have the Stoics, and you have some of the other philosophers, and one of them is the rationality, those who believed in the rationality. And the rationality believed that they understood that the universe is here and it functions, but they didn't understand how the universe worked. They knew that there was something that kept the universe ticking on a rational basis, something that kept the sun coming up roughly the same time every morning. There's something that made the moon rise in a lunar cycle. There's something that made the ocean waves or the currents come in, the tides come in, the tides come out. They understood that there were seasons, but they didn't know what that was. And interestingly enough, the word that they used was logos, which is the word that we have for word. So for those who believed in the rationality, whatever this mysterious something was that kept the world rational, they just called it the logos. So if you were to reread this from a standpoint of someone who believed in the rationality, you would read it, in the beginning was the rationality, or that which makes the world rational, and the word, and that which makes the that which makes the world rational was with God, and was actually the Jewish God. That's what verse 1 says, if that is your cultural, historic background for that word. But I mentioned that there were several other different schools of thought. You have Plato and Aristotle, and they didn't always agree. You also had other Greek philosophers. And one of the groups were the Stoics. And the Stoics also didn't fully understand the world, because who does fully understand the world? And they knew that there was something that made the world orderly. Not in the same sense that the rationality did, but this is something completely different. They understood that if you planted an orange seed, you got an orange tree. And if you planted, onion seeds, you got onions. But they didn't understand why. And they didn't understand what makes it structured in that way. Or in the same structured format, why is it that man forms governments? You find a tribe off in the Amazonian rainforest, and they're going to have some form of law, they're going to have some form of hierarchy. There's going to be chiefs, there's going to be chiefdainesses, there's going to be a matriarchy or a patriarchy. There's going to be something that they have formed outside of, without external influences. And that's going to be for every group of people that you find. They're going to have rules and laws and regulations and for crime and punishment is also going to exist. What is it that's inside of mankind that does that? What is it that keeps structure and order inside of plants? What is it that makes mankind structure and organize themselves? And the Stoics didn't have an answer for that, other than they just called it the Word. And so if you were a Greek Stoic philosopher and you began to read John chapter 1, in the beginning is that which keeps the world structured and orderly, and that was with God, and that was actually the Jewish God, that would read very differently for you. And then you have some Neoplatoisms, those who believed in that structure. Again, they wanted to know, why are things shaped the way they are? What brought us into being? They understood that there were many Greek gods, but there wasn't any one God that would bring all of those gods into order. Or what even made the world to begin with, that the Greek gods could then form and work with. And so that hierarchy, that next level up, they didn't understand it. And interestingly enough, they also simply called it the Word. And so if you are starting to understand, John writes very simplistically. This is elementary school level Greek. But John is jam-packing so much in. And so if you were a Neoplatoist, and you were reading John chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, that which created everything that we don't know about was with the Greek, or with the Jewish God, and it was the Jewish God. And he was in the beginning with the Jewish God, and all things were made through him. And then, verse 14, that became flesh and dwelt among men. That's kind of a mind-blowing thing. Now, whenever we read in English, it's just, in the beginning was the Word. It doesn't really make that much of an impact. But if you were a Greek, whatever school of thought you happen to follow under, this would mean a lot to you. Here is this something that you didn't understand about the world, its structure, its organization, that which makes it rational, all the things that would make it in the first place, all those things that you've wondered about and you have no good answers for, that you just labeled with the Word. John says, I have the answers for you, which is really, really cool. But it gets even neater than that, because the Jews are also one of the target audiences. And that's, if you look at the structure of John chapter 1, the first few verses, it echoes Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so you have this, the opening of the New Testament, as John writes, echoes the opening of the Old Testament as Moses wrote. But there's also a couple neat things there too. It's really super complicated depending on your historical, cultural background. So the first 5 books of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke. Yep, it's going to be one of those mornings. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those first 5 books, the books that we understand as being written by Moses, because God had asked him to write down the books of the law. This is called the law. So you would have the first 5 books that a lot of Jewish rabbis and teachers would call the law. And sometimes they would also just simply condense it as the Word. This is the Word of God. If you needed to follow after the Word, the things that they would refer to is the first 5 books. So that's, so you have this, the things that are wholly writ from God, inspired by God, penned by Moses, and they believed that by keeping the Torah, this made them worthy of the promises that were given unto Abraham. So there are some Jews, even today, who view the Torah as very different from the rest of the Old Testament, or for them as just the Testament. They have the law and the prophets. They view the Torah, the first 5 books, and then you have the historical books, and then you have books of poetry and prophecy. But the first 5 books are the ones that they view as, these are the ones that I have to live by. Historical books give a historical context. You have wisdom that gives me good instruction on life, and you have prophets who spoke to God, God's people in the past, but those aren't things that I necessarily have to live by. The first 5 books, that is what I have to live by. And so imagine yourself as a Jew who have lived, during the time that John writes. And for 400 years since the close of Malachi and the time period of Zephaniah, you've been waiting for God to continue to reveal his word, for God to speak again, for 400 years of silence. And then John says, that Old Testament law that you were so diligent to keep, the one that you revere above all the other writings of God, that was with God, and it was actually God. And here in verse 14, it became flesh and dwelt among us. And if you go back a little earlier, he mentions here that he came to his own in verse 10. And his own, or his own people, did not know him. You who believe that you are keeping this Torah so closely, you have failed to recognize God's word coming to life altogether. Or sometimes, if you didn't hold to the idea that the first 5 books were the most important, you have God's prophetic word as a whole. All of Old Testament was sometimes just referred to as the Word. And so this is, all the way from Genesis to Malachi was the Word. And so you have these 2 groups of people. You have the Greeks, who have their different schools of thought, and they all use the same terminology to describe that which they didn't know. And then you have the Jews, who even in their 2 different kind of schools of thought, use the exact same word to describe what they did know. And John takes all 5 of those ideas and he pieces them together here in John chapter 1. So Jesus is the Word. He's that which created all things. He is that which structures all things. He is that which gives order and rationality to the universe. He is the embodiment of God's Old Testament Word. He is the law that we are to live by. All of that comes forward here in John chapter 1. And so whenever you read John chapter 1, even though it's kind of simplistic language, take in the historical, cultural context. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and he was in the beginning with God. And all things were made through him, and without him there was not anything made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So these are verses that you've read a lot. I hope that, as you reread them in the future, understanding a bit more of the historical, cultural context, it means maybe a bit more to you. Because this is all the things that John is bringing in. His symbolism is kind of unparalleled in the New Testament. The way that he writes is really unlike how any of the other New Testament writer writes. In fact, John, word for word, John has written more in the New Testament than anybody else. Paul has more books, but John actually has more words in the New Testament. And he writes amazingly. Even though it's kind of simplistic language, he does the best job. If you will, keep your finger there in John 1. I just want to look at one other passage in Matthew chapter 4, sorry. Look at the first couple verses. This is one of the very first times you get to see Jesus speak in the New Testament. So, verse 1, Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." And he answered, "It is written, a man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." And while this may not be a completely direct tie to John chapter 1, it is a really, really important parallel. Because in John chapter 1, he mentions here in verse 4 that in him, meaning Jesus, was life, and the life was the light of men. We are commanded to live by every word that comes from God. And as we kind of commemorate this morning with the Lord's Supper, is that Jesus is our life. He is the source of our new covenant. He is the source of hope of eternal life with him. And we are to live by every single word of his. And so I just want to share a little bit about the historical context of John and to highlight the importance of what he writes, is that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the only Son. And through him, in verse 18 of John chapter 1, he makes known God to us, which is really, really neat. So there's just so much going on here in John chapter 1. That's just a little bit of it, just the first 18 verses. But I hope that it gives you new understanding, that as you move forward, this is the framework that John wants you to understand the rest of the events in John. He gives you so much more about who this person is that he's going to talk about in the rest of the book. So I hope that's a help for understanding John. I hope that's a help to understanding the first few verses in John. And I hope it helps us understand that whenever something kind of obscure is stated in the Bible, in the beginning was the Word, that if you start digging into it, it becomes so much richer. There's so much more to be gleaned by that. So I appreciate you being a good audience. Eddie, you want to hit the finish button for us?